Well, this lecture is covering Chapter 3 of Louis Vaughn's Doing Ethics, and in this chapter we're going to be evaluating moral arguments. Now, you're going to want to make sure that you read this chapter carefully, and you're going to want to make sure that you listen to this lecture carefully, because in your exam that's coming up this week, I'm going to be expecting that you use the types of arguments that we're going to be discussing in this chapter in the essay exams that you'll be completing. So if you want to know how is it that you engage in moral reasoning, or how is it that you make a moral argument, well, this chapter gives you the answer to that question. So to begin, we should discuss what is meant by moral reasoning. Your chapter defines moral reasoning as ordinary critical reasoning applied to ethics. And so to understand what that means, we first need to define what critical reasoning is. Sometimes it's called critical thinking, and it's really just the careful systematic evaluation of statements and arguments. So to understand that definition, we need to define both statements and arguments. So let's start with statements. So a statement is a claim. It's an assertion that something is either true or false. So if a sentence that you're looking at can either be described as being true or as being false, then that sentence is a statement. So a few examples would be murder is wrong. If you can say that that statement's either true or false, then that would be considered a statement. 1 plus 1 equals 2. If you can say it's true or false, then that's a statement. Shakespeare wrote The Tempest. Also could either be true or false, so that makes it a statement. Tuna are biting off the Washington coast. Well, this is a statement. If you read it a couple times, it's kind of a vague statement, so one of the things that you want to do in critical reasoning is make sure you're clear on what you mean by statements. So the phrase, tuna are biting off the Washington coast, can either be exciting if you're going fishing, or it can be terrifying if they're actually biting off the Washington coast. So in our statements, when we're engaging in critical reasoning, we want to make sure that we are clear on what statements mean. Another one that can be tricky is that kids make nutritious snacks. So again, either you're pleasantly surprised that kids can make nutritious snacks, or it could be terrifying if they are the ones being the nutritious snacks. So what we're engaging in when we're engaging in moral reasoning are statements, and we want to make sure that our statements are always clear. Now, once you have statements, you can progress to construct an argument. So an argument is really when you have one statement that is providing a reason for believing in another statement. And whenever you have that, you have an argument. Now, supporting statements are usually called premises in an argument, and a statement that is supported by these supporting statements or these premises is called the conclusion. So here's an example. Premise 1, all flowers are plants. So this premise is a statement that can either be true or false. Premise 2, all roses are flowers. And then conclusion. So you see these three dots on the screen there. Whenever you see these three dots in a syllogism, so the syllogism is just a form of an argument. Whenever you see three dots like this, that signifies that this is the conclusion. And the conclusion is, therefore, all roses are plants. Now, this is set up as an argument, and what you want to do is evaluate arguments to see whether or not the premises actually do support the conclusion. And if we're doing this, we can simplify the argument by simply using letters to fill in the blank for terms. So the argument, all flowers are plants, or the statement, all flowers are plants, could be stated as all M is P, and the statement, all roses are flowers, could be stated as all S is M, and then the conclusion, all roses are plants, could be stated as all S is P. And so if we break down each piece of these sentences, we have a way of evaluating whether or not the conclusion follows from the premises. And one simple way to evaluate arguments is simply to use what are called Euler diagrams. So if you look on your screen, I have the M statement, and we can place the M statement inside of the P statement. So this signifies the phrase all M is P. So the entirety of the M circle is inside the P circle. And then we can go one step further and we can draw the S circle, and this will signify the second premise, all S is M, and we draw the entirety of the S circle inside the M circle, and then we go down to the conclusion, all S is P. Well, is it the case that the entirety of the S circle is inside the P? And the answer is yes. And so what this means is that this is a valid argument. So to have a valid argument, all that means is that the structure of the statements are correct. To have a valid argument, it doesn't mean that the conclusion is necessarily true. What it means is that if each premise of the argument is true, then the conclusion is necessarily true. So when it comes to arguments, there are really two major forms of argument. The first is called a deductive argument, which is meant to give logically conclusive support to its conclusions. And actually, the argument that we just looked at would be an example of a deductive argument. And we'll look at other deductive arguments here in a moment. But there are also inductive arguments, and these arguments offer probable support to their conclusions. So when you think inductive arguments, just think of probability. And then I also included on here a bonus form. We're not going to be talking about this really in this lecture, but it's just worth knowing. There are also what are called abductive arguments, which you could say is just another form of an inductive argument. But what makes abductive arguments different is that these are what are called inferences to the best explanation. So this is a form of historical argumentation where you gather together distinct sets of data and you try to figure out what is the best explanation to explain a wide range of data. And so you have data in the present and you provide some sort of historical narrative that explains the data that we have in the present. And that is called abductive argument. But again, for this lecture, we're just going to be briefly looking at deductive arguments and inductive arguments. So when it comes to deductive arguments, there are valid forms and there are invalid forms. So I already talked about this notion here when we looked at the first deductive argument 2 slides back. But valid forms of deductive arguments are what's called affirming the antecedent. Sometimes it's called modus ponens. And then you can have denying the consequent, which is called modus tollens. And then there's also the hypothetical syllogism. These would be valid forms of arguments. And then you have invalid forms, and we'll look at an example of each of these here just in a moment. But one invalid form is what's called denying the antecedent, and another invalid form is affirming the consequent. So let's look at just a few examples of these. When it comes to modus ponens, that is simply refers to the structure if P then Q. You affirm the antecedent, which is P, and then it follows logically that Q must be true. So here's an example. If Mary is a mother, then she must be a woman. Premise 2, Mary is a mother. Conclusion, therefore, Mary is a woman. So if you accept that premise 1 is true and you accept that premise 2 is true, then it follows logically that the conclusion must also be true. Another valid form is modus tollens. This is where you deny the consequent. And so this would be if P, then Q. And now you deny the consequent. And so the consequent is Q. So you deny Q. And it follows logically that not P must be true. So again, we can look at an example. If Mary is a mother, then she must be a woman. Mary is not a woman, and therefore it follows logically that Mary is not a mother. So again, if you accept that premise 1 is true and you accept that premise 2 is true, then it follows logically that the conclusion must be true. The hypothetical syllogism is you have a premise where it's either P or Q, and you deny one, so you deny Q, and it follows logically that P must be true. So an example of this is either the 49ers or the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, the last Super Bowl. Well, if you can deny Q, so the 49ers did not win the Super Bowl, then it follows logically that the Chiefs did win the Super Bowl. And this is how hypothetical syllogisms work. So when you set up this type of argument, you do have to have a scenario where you only have two options, because if you have more than two options, then obviously this doesn't work. But in a hypothetical syllogism, you do have the case that it's either P or Q. And so if that statement is true, then it follows if you deny one, then the other must be true. So let's look at a couple invalid forms then. So the first invalid form is affirming the consequent. And so this is where you have the statement, if P then Q, but then you affirm Q, so you affirm the consequent. And from that you conclude P. Well, this would be a fallacious argument, and it should be obvious if you look at just an example to go with it. So if Mary is a mother, then she must be a woman. Well, Mary is a woman, therefore she must be a mother. Well, it should be clear when you look at this example what would be fallacious with this, because certainly there are women who are not mothers, and so the argument doesn't work that way. You can't affirm the consequent and still have a valid form of the argument. So this form would be considered invalid. A second invalid form is where you deny the antecedent. So this is if P then Q, and then you say not P, and then you conclude not Q. Well, this is a fallacy, and it should be clear if we look at this example. If Mary is a mother, then she must be a woman. Mary is not a mother, therefore you conclude that Mary is not a woman. Well, of course, that doesn't follow logically, because there are plenty of people who are not mothers, but they are still women. And so this form, even if the premises are true, would not be a valid structure. And so when it comes to arguments, then deductive arguments, you have valid and invalid arguments. So again, a valid argument is just an argument that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. That's all a valid argument is stating. An invalid argument is an argument where the premises do not support the conclusion. And so if the premises are true, then the conclusion may or may not be true. The conclusion doesn't depend on the premises in an invalid argument. Now, you would contrast that distinction between valid and invalid with the distinction of an argument that's sound versus an argument that's unsound. A sound argument is an argument that is valid and all of the premises are true. So when somebody says that you have a sound argument, then what that means is that the conclusion of your argument is correct. It must be true. That's what it means to say that an argument is sound. Now, you can have a valid argument and the conclusion's false. If the conclusion is false in a valid argument, all that means is one of the premises must be false. But if the premises are true and you have a valid argument, then what you have is a sound argument. The conclusion must be true. An unsound argument is invalid and or any of the premises might be false. So an unsound argument could be an argument where the premises are true, but the conclusion doesn't follow. In that case, the argument's not valid and it's also not sound. But it could also be the case that you have an argument where the structure is valid. It's a valid structure, but just one of the premises are false, and in that case, you have an unsound argument. So make sure that you have those distinctions correct when you are looking at your quiz coming up for this week. When it comes to inductive arguments, we're not talking about sound versus unsound or valid versus invalid arguments. Instead, when we have inductive arguments, we're thinking about ideas such as strong versus weak arguments. So a strong argument offers probable support to its conclusions, whereas a weak argument does not offer probable support. And the key word here is probability. So we're just looking for um, we're just looking for probable arguments when we're thinking about inductive arguments. A cogent argument is strong, and all of the premises are true. And therefore, if you have a cogent argument, the conclusion is probably true. If it's not cogent, then this is a weak and or any of the premises of the argument would be false. So this is how you think about strong versus weak arguments and cogent versus non-cogent. So let's look at some examples here of inductive arguments. So take the statement, all swans that we've ever seen have been white, and so we're just going to base that off of the experience that maybe you've had or I've had, and therefore we conclude that the next swan that we see will probably be white. Well, inductive arguments are usually based off of experience. It could be just your own individual experience, or it could be the experience that you've had plus the testimony of other people's experience. And so let's say we want to set up this argument in some sort of syllogism. Well, you could make this a fairly large syllogism where you have premise 1, the first swan that I saw was white, 2, swan 2 was white, premise 3, swan 3 was white, all the way down to swan 1001 was white, and therefore you conclude, based on all of your prior experience, that the next swan we see will be white. But now, if this is going to be an inductive argument, we want to make sure that we add the word probably, because in inductive arguments, we don't have certain conclusions. All we can have is conclusions that are probably true. We can look at another example here, and that is the example that the sun will probably rise tomorrow because it has risen every day of my life. So this is just an inductive way of reasoning, and if we put it into a syllogism, on day 1 the sun rose, day 2 the sun rose, day 3 the sun rose, day 12,410 the sun rose, and therefore we conclude that the sun will probably rise tomorrow. Now, when we're looking at inductive arguments, I've already said that these are probabilistic arguments, but there is a famous problem known as the problem of induction. And this problem really centers on the whole idea that these arguments aren't certain and there are exceptions to them, as you could think of many different exceptions. So one just example with what's going on in the world right now is every semester that ethics has been offered in the past, there has been a face-to-face offering. And this has been the case throughout the history of the university. And so if we were to set this up into an argument, semester 1, when the university started, ethics was offered face-to-face. Semester 2, ethics was offered face-to-face. 3, ethics was offered face-to-face. All the way down to semester 277, ethics was offered face-to-face. So before this year started, ethics, there was a likely chance, a good chance, that ethics would probably be offered face-to-face. But of course, given the global pandemic, that ended up not being the case. Even though there was a likely chance that it would happen, we know that it didn't happen, and for this semester, all ethics courses offered at SDSU are offered online. And so this really gets at the heart of why the problem of induction is significant. So the problem of induction asks the question, how do we know that the future will be like the past? Well, when it comes to the example that I just gave, our reasoning might go something like this. Every semester, ethics is offered face-to-face. Therefore, we conclude that next semester, ethics will probably be offered face-to-face. Well, when you set up this argument, there's a missing premise. And so what is that missing premise? The missing premise really is an assumption, and it's the assumption that the future will resemble the past. So whenever you have an assumption in your argument, you want to ask, what makes this assumption reasonable? Well, to make an assumption reasonable, what you have to do is construct another argument to see whether or not that assumption is sound or not, whether it's a good assumption to hold. Well, we can put it into its own argument, and we might say, well, in the past, the future has resembled the past, and therefore we think that in the future will resemble the past. But again, you have the same problem that comes up, and that is you have an assumption that the future will resemble the past, which you're assuming the conclusion before you get to the conclusion. And we're at this sort of infinite cycle of how do you justify this assumption? And there really is no great answer to this problem. Whenever it comes to inductive reasoning, you just have to make this assumption, otherwise you can't engage in induction at all. And if you can't engage in induction, well, then that takes away any chance of reliably making predictions about the future. And so this is just, you can just say that this is just one basic problem in philosophy where we have to assume this, even though there's really no good reason to assume it. So that is the problem of induction. We need inductive arguments, but they're really resting on an assumption, not only that can't be demonstrated, but it's the type of assumption that is very much circular in its reasoning. Okay, so now we move from just general critical thinking to talking about how do we use critical thinking in moral reasoning. And to do that, we just have to think about moral statements. So a moral statement is just a statement affirming that an action is right or wrong, or that a person is good or bad. So for example, capital punishment is wrong. That's a moral statement. Jenna should not have lied. Again, that's a moral statement. And you can compare that with non-moral statements, which are states of affair that are either true or false, but you're not assigning a moral value to it. So an example here would be, many people think that capital punishment is wrong. Notice this is not a moral statement. You're just describing what people think. If you want to make a moral statement, you have to make a judgment on whether it's right or wrong for many people to think that capital punishment is wrong. But just stating the fact is not a moral statement. Or if you say that Jenna did not lie, again, that's not a moral statement. You're just stating a factual statement that can either be true or false. And so when we're talking about moral statements, we're talking about things that can either be right or wrong, or good or bad. So now if we want to construct a moral argument, there's a few things that we need to know about how moral arguments work. So every moral argument should offer at least one premise that is a moral statement and affirms a moral principle. And without a moral premise, we can't make a moral argument. So you just need to have that because we can't establish what ought or should be based solely on what is. So there has to be at least one statement that is a moral principle. And every moral argument should also include at least one premise that is a non-moral statement. So here is an example of this. So premise one, we have an argument that it is immoral to take the life of an innocent human being. So this is a moral statement that is offering a moral principle. So is it wrong to take the life of an innocent human being? If you say, yes, it's wrong, then you go to premise two. Now notice this is going to be a non-moral statement. John took the life of an innocent human being. This is a factual premise. It's either true or false. You can't say it's good or bad. It's just a true or false statement. But you can place a moral statement on top of a non-moral statement to come up with a conclusion. And in this case, you have the conclusion, therefore, John's action was immoral. And so this is the way that moral arguments work. You have moral statements, a non-moral statement, and you conclude with a moral judgment. Now, when you're evaluating moral arguments, you want to test the premises of the argument. So you could have a premise in the argument that says something like, causing a person's death is wrong. Well, to test this type of premise, you want to consider whether this is true in all possible circumstances, or if there are some places where it's actually morally acceptable to cause a person's death. And so you could think of examples like self-defense, war, to save many lives over fewer lives. So is there any case where you can think of that it would be morally permissible to cause a person's death? And if so, then you have an objection to the premise. And so this is how you test moral premises. Now, when you're engaging in moral reasoning, you want to make sure that you avoid bad arguments. Now, there are common forms of bad arguments in just basic critical reasoning, and those types of bad arguments happen in moral reasoning as well. And they come in many different shapes and sizes, but all bad arguments have at least one of these problems. One, at least, there's one false premise in the argument, and so that's what makes it a bad argument, or simply that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises of the argument. Now, I will have you on your own read pages 56 through 60 for examples of logical fallacies in moral reasoning, and you want to make sure that you read those examples closely so that when you're writing your essay exam this week that you don't commit any of these fallacies, because these will be some of the fallacies that I'll be looking for when I'm looking at your essay. And so this brings us to the end of this lecture then, and thinking about writing and speaking about moral issues. So when you're writing your essay this week, I want you to be thinking about whether you have a logical structure to your essay. So do you have something in your essay that has a moral principle, and is it clearly stated? Do you have something in your essay that has a non-moral statement that is a piece to building the argument to some conclusion? And when you think about the conclusion of your essay, I want you to think of your conclusion as also the thesis. So in most writing classes, one of the principles of good writing is you want to have a clear thesis statement. Well, when it comes to critical reasoning, or when it comes to moral reasoning, the thesis statement really should just be the conclusion of an argument. So when you write a thesis statement in the introduction to your essay, be thinking in the body of your essay how you're going to be able to construct an argument that demonstrates that that thesis statement is reasonable. And so I want you to be thinking about that when you're writing your essay this week. So essential elements of good moral essays or conversations follow these principles. So when you have a claim, you want to make sure that it can be proved. And if it can't be proved, if it can be demonstrated to be more reasonable than not. You want to always be thinking about, is there an argument for or against the claim that you're making? You don't ever want to try to hide a good argument against a claim that you're making. You want to bring that to the light and respond to it. And you want to make sure that you're always showing that you have a consideration of alternative views and that you can adequately respond to it. So that's all that I have for this lecture. If you have any questions about any of this, have any questions about the exam, please feel free to email me and let me know.